Are you a runner who is constantly in the injury cycle and now you're realizing there's a way to do the thing we love to do, which is run, and do it the right way? If you're a dedicated runner and you want to learn how to stay healthy and how to become a smarter runner, this is what we're talking about today, which is how do we actually prevent running injuries? We're going to break down the science of injury prevention and how you can implement proper load management principles into your training. Welcome to episode 161 on the Healthy Runner podcast, where we help you get stronger, run faster, and enjoy lifelong injury-free running. Today, I have the pleasure of having my good friend from down under back on the show, Brodie Sharpe. Welcome back, Brodie.
Excited to be back, Duane. Yeah, and a good topic today. I'm excited.
Yeah, and this is actually, I went back and looked at the archives here, and this is your fourth time being a guest on the show, which is definitely takes the title for the most appearances by any guest who is not a part of our Healthy Runner coaching team. So congrats to you, Brodie, for winning that award.
And it's always such a pleasure coming on. Like I say, I could chat about this sort of stuff all day. So thanks for giving me the outlet to talk about this, because I get jittery if I don't go on rants and talk about these sort of topics too often.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to honestly share your knowledge here on the Healthy Runner podcast. And for those who have been, hiding under the running podcast rocks for some reason, you don't know who this guy is. This is Brodie Sharpe. He's a physiotherapist, the host of the Run Smarter podcast, and the author of the new book, Run Smarter. And I'm super excited to have him back on the show because he always brings his A game with his insightful knowledge and application to running injury prevention, training, and performance. And I'm sure today will be no different. So in this episode, Brodie is really going to educate you on why proper load management is one of the most important concepts you need to master as a runner to become a smarter, faster runner. And we're going to chat about kind of stress science, understanding principles of load versus capacity and what that means. And honestly, if you master these concepts, this just may be the key to unlocking your potential as a runner and really staying out of that injury cycle that we see so often. So yeah, Brodie, I'm excited to chat about this topic with you and get your take. And yeah, first, I guess I need to say, man, congratulations on the new book. It is just an amazing resource that you have compiled for runners, and you did it in fairly short amount of time. So I need to congratulate you, because I remember when you told me when you first started working on it, and you pumped this thing out. So kudos to you.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, it was in my eyes, it was probably the hardest project I've ever undertaken. From like someone looking from the outside in, it did get done in probably just over 12 months, which seems like the blink of an eye in some book circumstances. But that was, 5-6 hours a day of writing and, going through quotes and recording and images and all that sort of stuff. I had no idea what it would entail when I very first undertook the project, but very glad to have it out. Very glad to have a copy that I can look at and flick through, and very, very proud of myself and happy with the overall outcome.
Yeah, it is quite honestly the masterpiece, and it is a far more valuable copy than like the 3 years I spent on my dissertation and have a book in my office that no one will ever read or care about. So your book is actually very actionable, and many runners are going to be able to benefit. And, we'll definitely get into this later, but you can, anyone, we'll pitch it right now, honestly, because I'm very strong, that many runners should be reading this book if they're really looking for like injury prevention as well as like increasing performance. They can get it on Amazon. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so most online stores, mostly Amazon is probably the most popular, but in most online distribution channels, you should be able to find, Run Smarter. If you type in Run Smarter, Brodie Sharpe, it should pop up straight away.
Awesome. And yeah, so I do want to kind of get into this topic of injury prevention, since it is kind of really one half of your book. So you kind of broke it down into, preventing injuries. And then the second part is really increasing performance. So getting into this preventing injury kind of topic, in your mind, how do we prevent injuries as runners? I know
Yeah.
it's kind of a huge question, but
I can kind of break it down. Like I said, I've wrote the book on it, so I think I should be able to answer it. And that's exactly right. Like the book itself, the first part is reducing the risk of injuries because, with my podcast audience and Facebook group, you know, and most of the runners I talk with, that's the number one topic that people come up with. It's like, what do you want to hear more about? Oh, reducing my risk of injuries. That's number one. And the number two is usually, oh, I want to increase my running performance. I want to do a marathon in the safest way possible, or do a faster 10K, or, it's usually one of those two things, which is why I've set it out the book in a way that, part one, these are 10 principles, 10 chapters to reduce your risk of injury. If you want to increase your running performance, part two, again, 10 more chapters covering those things. And yeah, we start off like we dive straight into it. Like part one, part two, or like the first few chapters of part one is about the key principles to preventing injury. And to answer your question, how do we prevent injuries? Well, in the physio world, we focus on what we call the big rocks, in your training at the time of your injury, or, stuff that revolves around your training. What are the big rocks that we need to focus on? And then we have, littler rocks that we maybe can focus on. We've got pebbles that probably aren't that warranted. And then we've got like grains of sand that, should just be avoided altogether, or like not even worried about. And so the big rocks are your training loads. It is this load versus capacity model that every runner should understand. And a lot of this can be quite detailed, quite scientific, quite like, science heavy, but we try and break it down and reframe it in a way that every runner can understand. And, these sort of generic principles, hopefully you sort of can get the concept. And when it comes to load versus capacity, if you can envision that every ligament, tendon, muscle, bone, every sort of component within your body has a certain limitation, it has a certain capacity that it can withstand. And in your training, if you create an environment that exceeds that capacity, then it's going to start breaking down rather than building up. Essentially, what we want to do in our training is we want to find a sweet spot that still challenges those structures, because we don't want to do nothing, or we don't want to underload yourself, or we don't want to get complacent and, just do what you can tolerate without seeing any progression. We sort of want to challenge those structures, those tissues, and we want to recover on the back end. And as we recover, we get stronger. But what we don't want to do is train too much, have too much of an abrupt change in your training, and exceed the capacity of one of those things, one of those structures. It might be your Achilles tendon. It might be your plantar fascia. It might be your patellofemoral joint, or the kneecap. If you do something that's too much, too abrupt, and your body isn't ready for it, and it exceeds the capacity, and then you continue to exceed that capacity, then your body will start showing signs of symptoms. And if it's mismanaged, it can then lead into an injury. And so understanding this in a few ways can then start reflecting. You can start reflecting on your past training. You can see, okay, at the time of my injury, or if I have had an injury in the past, around that time, what was happening? And the vast majority of the times you can relate it to this load versus capacity model. It might not be as obvious. It might not be just like an abrupt, okay, I doubled my mileage from week one to week two. It might be a little bit more subtle, and there might be some recovery components, or stress or sleep, or those sorts of things. But, I think we've seen a lot of injured runners in the past, and you can pretty much point most of them to an abrupt change in physical, mechanical load. Curious to hear your experiences and what you think on that topic.
Yeah, I would say that is by far the most common thing we see, right? When a runner comes to us I just talked to a runner yesterday, right? IT band syndrome. And, going through that history, like you said, this runner had an injury to the hamstring, had some nerve issues, basically went to a medical provider who shut them down for 6 weeks, said, no running, we need to get you pain free, discharged them, and said, go back to running. This individual was signed up for a race and still wanted to run this marathon. So when we went back in the training log, like you said, she really went from not running for 6 weeks to within 8 days, 10 days, I believe it was, trying a 16-mile log run. So you can guess how that went, right? And the knee swelled up, severe pain around the IT band. So I think that's just to put it in, I guess, context for someone listening here. And, the old adage is kind of doing too much too soon. And when you say load, what you're really saying is like the stress to a specific tissue, whether it is that IT band, the Achilles, the fascia, right? So it's whatever stress, and it could be running too many miles. It could be running too fast. It could be doing too much speed workouts in your week. It could be increasing your weekly running volume, right? Like your mileage. All of that is load. Are there any other examples that you can think of that we can kind of put that in context for the listeners?
Yeah, we can say change terrain, change hills, like all of this changes things up on your body. Other things that people might not realize is like if you abruptly change your shoes to something that's a little bit more like minimalist or barefoot or something like that, that all these things are fine. Like you can do speed work. You can transition to minimalist shoes if you want to. You can progress to heels if you wanted to. But the idea is you can't make it an abrupt shift. You need to give your body time to adapt to those things. And going back to your example with that ITB syndrome, not only are we looking at the physical load, which is doing a long run after some time off. Okay, that's an abrupt change. But there's also load versus capacity. So that's the load side of things. But the capacity side is that, okay, you've had an injury, which the recommended advised thing you do is take time off. And if you take several weeks off, what that does is reduce the capacity of everything else in your body. And so we want to make sure that we preserve a lot of the capacity in these circumstances. You know, whether we rest injuries is a good conversation to have, because a lot of runners who listen to my podcast, they eventually learn that, absolute rest from an injury is in some circumstances like the worst thing you could do. If it is a bone stress reaction or a stress fracture, yes, we want to take the necessary time off. But for most overuse injuries, you need to still stimulate that area, because we want to preserve as much capacity as possible. And yes, we don't want to overload it and continue to irritate it, but there is some middle ground there. It's not absolute rest. It's not continue with your overloaded training. There's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and that was actually the last topic that we talked about on the Healthy Runner podcast was episode 114. You shared with us kind of to run or not to run with an injury, right? That is the question.
Yeah.
And do we stop running? And you did share some of the rare circumstances that runners actually need to stop running, but I agree wholeheartedly that the majority of the running related injuries that we see, and we know that, those that are listening to this, those that are listening to your show, because we actually did do some research on this past fall with the research survey that I sent out. And, thank you again for sending out to your community. 90% of our essential listeners have had a running related injury. So we know injuries are out there. And I think like today's topic, Brodie, is the key, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the opening, the key to preventing these injuries from occurring versus, you as a runner right now listening to this and just feeling like my body's broken, or I'm just not meant for running, or, I can't tolerate running. I can never be a fast runner, or I can never run a marathon, right? It's understanding this principle that Brodie's talking about, is this: how much load you're putting through your body and allowing your body to actually adapt to the demands, because our bodies are like amazing, right? You hear about these like incredible stories of people running across the country, right? And running, these crazy distances in my mind, right? And we've had people on the show, and I know you've had folks on your show as well, right? Like, just to think like running 100 miles is, to me, sounds like crazy, right? Like, my body would not tolerate it, because I do not have the tissue capacity built up for my tissues to tolerate the load of running like 100-mile race, right? But
Absolutely.
if we're patient enough and we allow our bodies to adapt, then we could gradually increase the amount of load. And then if we increase our tissue capacity, then we could do like some of these amazing things that, these runners are doing out there.
Yeah, can I bring up as well, because you bring up an interesting point. You said that some runners, they feel like their body's broken because they break down every time they train too hard or something like that. People can go down the path of getting an injury, getting assessed, and then feel like their body's letting them down because after a manual assessment, they find all these inadequacies or imperfections or imbalances, malalignments, those sorts of things. It's very, very common for someone to get knee pain because they trained too much. And then a therapist assess them and say, hey, you actually have one leg longer than the other, or you overpronate on just one side, or, oh, your hips are tilted, oh, your pelvis is out of place, like all those sorts of things, which we know in a healthy population is extremely common. We know 90% of the healthy population have some sort of leg length discrepancy and they're fine. And you had that leg length discrepancy before this injury and you were completely fine. It was only the catalyst was just training too much that sort of caused that issue. And that's why I brought up at the start, we focus on the big rocks. The big rocks are your training load versus capacity. The smaller rocks are kind of like your strength imbalances, your flexibility imbalances, which, yeah, you kind of want to address, but it's not the catalyst. Like, technically speaking, if you had your Achilles is 80% the strength of your other Achilles, if you train just under your training load to meet that weaker Achilles, then you won't get an Achilles tendinopathy. You won't overload that Achilles tendinopathy. But if you do overtrain, it's that Achilles that's going to be the first thing that pops up because that's kind of like a weak link. But if you have good training principles, that's never going to happen. And people can really go down a dark path of saying, my body's letting me down because I have all of these imbalances, all of these malalignments. My spine's out, my hips are out, my glutes aren't activating, my quads are overactivating. And it can be quite worrying for a lot of people. But I've seen a ton of runners. I've worked with hundreds of runners that come to me and say, I feel like my body's letting me down. And you just lay out a load versus capacity solution and they get better and their confidence restores and they're back to running what they want to do. Yes, it's a patient process. You do need to practice patience, but you can get there in the end and restore a bit of confidence in your body.
I couldn't agree more. And I found that has been the key to success, and really what changed my career, honestly, trajectory in helping runners, has been figuring that piece out. Right. And it wasn't the, manual techniques that I was doing with patients. And I think, for you and I both, like working with runners all over the world, virtually, that we are able to get runners back because we understand this concept, right? And like you said, it is those large rocks. Like, and that was great that you used that analogy, because I use that a lot of like, how are you going to fill the jar, right? If you got the large rocks, medium rocks, and you got like small pebbles and sand, which one do you put in first? If you put the smaller stuff in first, the big stuff doesn't fit. So you got to start with those large rocks. And yeah, I completely agree. And, for those that have been, listening to this podcast, and, you guys did hear kind of my 6-step plan on how like we stay healthy as runners. really the two areas that we're really talking about today is the run plan, like we talked about running and how much load we're doing. And then I think what we're going to be probably delving into is how we build up that tissue capacity at some point, and that's going to be kind of the strength training that we talked about in episode 159, when we kind of how do we grow as runners, right? So those are these two like key components that Brodie's talking about from like a science level, is balancing this load versus tissue capacity. And before we get into like the tissue capacity side of things, Brodie, is there, I guess, can you give us an example of how someone would be able to increase load? And I would imagine it's probably going to depend upon like their tissue capacity and like their level of fitness, right? And like their running experience, and do they, have they been strength training for 10 years or 20 years in the gym? But can you give like an example for someone listening and they're like, okay, don't do too much too soon. Like, what's a good example that, someone might be able to relate to?
Yeah. And like you say, gathering data beforehand, really important because everyone's different. Whether they've had injuries in the past is also a good insight to have. But if someone clean slate, hasn't ran before, wants to start running, you then look at, okay, if they wanted to build up their load, how much wiggle room do we have? How safe do we think? How robust do we think they are when it comes to adding on load? Because people don't realize, but you generate a lot of load when you run. 2 to 3 times your body weight goes through your body every single step that you take. And if someone's unhealthy or has been sedentary for a couple of years, maybe a little bit overweight, all of those things like really generate a high amount of force on your body. And so, yeah, we ask questions about, do you do strength training? Do you do cross training? Do you do sports? If you did those things, how long ago did you do them? How progressive were you with them? And you just get a general sense of how strong you feel like they are. And then you start embarrassingly short and embarrassingly slow, and you build up from there. And it's horrible for the first couple of weeks because people are thinking, why am I doing this? Why am I doing these walk run programs? Can't I just walk, or can't I just run continuous and run at the speed I want? You can do that, but your risk of injury increases. And it depends on how much risk you want to take on. If someone is a seasoned runner or just like a recreational runner 3 times a week, 15 miles per week, and wants to then increase from there, we then have a look. Okay, what's your strength training? How much strength training do you participate in? How long have you been running? How long have you been running injury free for? Are you managing an injury? All those sorts of things will factor in how much sort of leeway or wiggle room we might have when it comes to, building on mileage. And we usually start with slow miles. We usually start with, okay, let's just increase 1 or 2 miles per week, spread it across the week, see how things go. If someone is only running twice a week and wants to run more often, then we would spread that same mileage across more weeks. So if they're running, 5 miles twice a week, well, let's run 3 miles 3 times a week and sort of just spread it more across the week so you have more opportunities to adapt. And then we just slowly build up from there. We start with slow running, build it up. Once you've got a pretty decent foundation, we can then introduce some speed. Some abrupt changes that people have, especially when recovering from injury, is they're very cautious. And so all of their running is really slow, but then their next progression is doing all of their running just a little bit faster. That's someone's, progression, but that's too much. You want to keep most of it slow, but then just find one day to go a little bit faster and then see how you feel. And we're using this to and fro. We make these clinical justifications or these decisions based on the individual, but it also comes down to listening to your body. These are all just guessing games that we have. If you are injured, yes, I'll take more of a cautious progression. If you haven't been injured in 12 months and you look quite strong, yes, we sort of progress a little bit more aggressively, you might say, but we then have to go back and revert to what's your body telling you? How much spring do you have in your step? How fresh are you feeling on your runs? How tight are you getting? What's your muscle soreness the next day? Like all these sort of things we then pay attention to, because as a coach, as a therapist, we just guess, and we guess on our best assumption based on all the data we gather. But then it solely relies on, okay, now how are you responding to that? And then we make more justifications and more decisions off that.
Yeah, and I really like how I think really what you're referring to is what you referred to in your book is like finding that adaptation like sweet spot. And I
Mm,
loved your graphics in your book of kind of not where, you're underloading, right? Because you do want to improve your fit, like all of us who run, right? We want to obviously get better. Like who doesn't want to get better, right? You want to do more distances, you want to run faster eventually. But I agree, most novice runners make that mistake of getting not underloading, but they jump all the way up to overloading and they're not finding that adaptation sweet spot. And I tell most of my runners who are starting out, if they're doing couch to 5K or, you know, if they're starting out, honestly, in their first year to 2 years, like I still consider you a novice runner. You really need to look at running as it should be somewhat boring when you do it. It should not feel like you're getting this amazing workout and you're getting a runner's high when you go out there, because if you are pushing that hard, like you would in, let's say, a cycling class or a HIIT workout that you're used to doing in the gym, and you're like, oh, I've seen all these people running outside. That looks like fun. Or maybe I could be a runner. Let me like use that for my exercise or use that for my weight loss. And they do too much, right? And now they're really kind of, the load is exceeding what their tissue capacity, and they're getting into that overload zone. And then that's when we see, most people getting injured. So it's almost having like the patience to be okay with, hey, I'm going to run to allow my body to adapt to the demands of running, as opposed to saying like, hey, I'm going to be a runner because it's like a really good form of exercise. I'm going to lose a lot of weight and I'm going to burn so many calories.
mm.
Thoughts?
Well, can I throw another question back at you? When you say that running should be boring, assuming that you're talking about like effort levels or speed or something like that, do you have any
Yes.
advice on what slow running kind of looks like?
Yeah, it's keeping it in that easy zone. And that's thank you for that clarification that it is somewhat easy. It's not very hard. If we're using rating of perceived exertion, I used to say a 4 out of 5, but I think most people overestimate. So now I tell my clients a 3. Like
Mm,
especially if I am, more on the conservative end and they're just getting back into from an injury, and they are surprised that, well, you're actually like I could really run 4 times a week. And I thought you brought up a great point before about the frequency, Brodie, because that's like classic, right? Like how many runners have you seen? It's like, I got a bad knee or I got a history of, plantar fasciitis. I can never run back to back days. So I only run 3 times a week because I know if I run back to back days, my injury gets worse. And how many times it's like just changing that frequency, like you said. And so many people, and us runners, I'm guilty as charged, type A, like go out there and run 5 miles 3 times a week or 4 miles 3 times a week, right? The same mileage. And when I'm designing my, run plans for my clients, it's like, yeah, there's going to be that 4 miler, and the next day you're going to run maybe 2, right? If we're being more conservative and that's your only back to back day, if we're doing a 4-day run plan. But I agree with you, like increasing the frequency of running throughout your week is actually like protective for your body, because, and I know, you're going to get into like, how do we build up that tissue capacity? You mentioned before, like increasing the frequency of the number of days you're running can be like super protective versus going out there for a longer session, less frequent throughout the week. But yeah, going back to your original question was effort level, where it should feel easy. You should be able to, we call it conversational pace running, where you can talk to someone next to you. The other thing is really just if you want to go by heart rate, we are staying in what we call zone 2 of, your heart rate zones. And you should feel like, hey, I'm only going out there, or I'm going out there for 1 mile. I'm going out there for 2. I'm going out for 3. But you could probably do this for like an hour or an hour and a half if you needed to at this effort level. Yeah, that's how I kind of describe that to my clients.
How many runners finish a workout, finish a run, and then think to themselves, I could continue for another hour? Like it's rare, but that's what you should be doing in your easy workouts. You should be feeling like you should finish the workout feeling, relatively fresh. But a lot of people have the idea of, okay, I've listened to Duane. He says a 3 on the RPE scale. So I'm going to run a 3. And then you run for the first 3 quarters of it at a 3 out of 10. And then you're like, oh, I'm feeling too fresh and there's only, 10 minutes to go. Let me pick it up a little bit. And then, by the end, you're sort of like sprinting towards the end and then you're out of breath and you've, blown that out of proportion. A few things you mentioned that I'd like to talk about. Almost every sentence that you say, I'm like, oh, I have something to say about that. So apologies if we're jumping back and forth.
No, I love it.
Your example of someone who's injured and they say, oh, I can't run back to back days because every time I run back to back days, my injury gets worse. Some of the principles that I teach on the podcast is paying attention to your symptoms, like during, after, and the next day. And one of the key rules is you need to return back to baseline symptoms within 24 hours. Less than 12 hours is better, but less than 24 hours is like standard. And if you go from a run back to back days and that increases your symptoms, it means that that first run that you did, your symptoms haven't returned back to baseline. And that means that that first run that you did has been too much. It's been too long, too hard, or too many hills, or some component in there means that it's too much. And what you want to do is find out what speed, what duration, what shoes, what terrain all meet those conditions and meet those pain kind of parameters or pain rules. And then you can increase your frequency after that. And then once you increase your frequency, you think of it as more days throughout the week that your body can adapt. If you run once a week, your body's going to struggle to adapt and get stronger and get fitter. Your cardiovascular system isn't going to get the same sort of stimulus. And, you're not going to progress to becoming a better runner compared to someone who runs 3 days. And they're not going to become a faster, better runner more efficiently compared to someone who runs 5 days. And so, yes, there is a certain limit. You can't run every single day because you need recovery and you need a good balance. But running 5 days a week gives your body, if it's in that adaptation sweet spot, gives your body another opportunity to recognize that stimulus and say, oh, this is what you want me to adapt to. Let me go through my adaptation process and suit those conditions that you're giving me. And so some very key universal components within there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thank you for that clarification. And before we get into kind of building up, kind of how do we build up tissue capacity, you kind of talked about this objective way of monitoring our load, and if someone is currently recovering from an injury, and like finding out what their pain is during activity, how long does it last for. And I've heard you talk about that many times on your podcast. And those questions, I think, are definitely gold, right, in making those decisions on whether or not to run or not to run, like the next day, and how much you do run. Could you just talk about, before we're talking about like how do we build up tissue capacity, and I think it's going to kind of go to what areas should runners focus on in building up tissue capacity? You have a great figure in your book about body weight of force, like the percentage of body weight of force when we're running, and then kind of running at different speeds. Can you just talk a little bit about like the impact of running has on our bodies, and like what areas of the bodies are impacted most with running?
Yeah, I'd love to. And This is from Tim Dawn's paper. I think it was a 2018 paper, and I just extrapolated the data and put it into a graph, which has like on an axis of once you start increasing your running speed, how hard do muscle groups need to work? And put it on an axis of compared to your body weight. And I show this to some of my clients all the time, particularly because I see a lot of hamstring clients, a lot of proximal hamstring tendinopathy clients. That one is pretty stark in terms of its, I guess, exponential demand to meet once you increase your speed. Because when you run, let's use your calf or your soleus as an example. It works pretty bloody hard, even with slow running. You look at your soleus muscle, which is a muscle, a part of your calf complex. It works 6 to 8 times your body weight every single step that you take. And even at slower speeds, 6 times your body weight is enormous. And yeah, when you start increasing your running speed, it starts to slowly increase. So it gets maybe up to 7, maybe up to 8, and doesn't really reach, doesn't really spike too much. It just works hard the entire time. But then you have something like your hamstring, which works maybe 2 times your body weight when you're operating at slow speeds. And as you increase your speed, it exponentially increases the demand. And so it's not this linear fashion. And people realize they're surprised when they do their hard sessions that they can do pretty well. But when they do their sprint sessions, like that next level up, they develop a hamstring strain or a hamstring tendinopathy. And it's because that little the next gear up, your hamstring's probably working twice as hard, and it can work like ridiculous amounts. And that's because like the faster you run, the harder your hamstring needs to decelerate. The swinging leg has that eccentric component during the terminal swing phase. And yeah, it's that, and your hip flexors have that same exponential growth or that exponential demand with speed. Your quads, they work, 2 to 3 times your body weight. That doesn't really change based on speed. And it's really interesting to point out and very obvious when you have a look at a runner, look at their history, look at their changes in running speeds and what injuries sort of develop because of that. It's it's a pretty stark reminder.
Yeah, and I would say, there's two things that really stick out to me in that graph is, like you said, the exponential increase in hip muscle involvement as we run faster. So, from a training perspective, I think about, the runners that are running slow, which we know that the majority of our training should be at, right, like 80%, if we're using 80-20 rule, should be at easy running, slower running. But if you're always running slow in training and then you like to do races and you like to push yourself at races, and now you're trying to run fast, but you actually didn't train your body to run fast and you didn't strengthen your hip flexor muscle specifically, your hamstring muscle specifically, then you're going to be more at risk for injuring those muscles when you try to run faster at races. But the other thing that really got me with that graph, Brodie, is how much difference there is in the load to the calf muscles, specifically the soleus, more so than the quads, more so than the hip flexors, hamstring, with all speeds of running until we get to the fastest, and we shift from the ankle to the hip muscles. And how many runners neglect, and I was guilty as charged for a good 8 years of my first 8 years as a runner. I like never, strengthened my calf muscles. It was like the neglected muscle, like always, growing up like a gym rat, like after college, all that stuff. Like I hated working out calves. Like they're just not fun. Like it's not fun exercise in the gym. Like no one's like getting all jazzed up to be like, yeah, today's calf day, or I'm gonna really, strengthen my calves. And for me personally, Brodie, like once I started, getting some more of this information and realizing how much of a demand the calf is under when we run, and really doubling down and prioritizing that in my strengthening and doing it specifically, singling out soleus versus the gastroc, the bigger muscle with the knee straight, has been huge, like on just staying healthy and if anyone's listening to this right now and you are not doing any dedicated work to your calf muscles in order to stay healthy, it's because when we are running, like the greatest amount of body weight per force and cross section of that muscle is going through your calf. It is working the hardest out of any of our muscles in our legs. And it's pretty staggering, like when you look at that chart to me on like how much higher that calf muscle is.
Yeah. And you can strengthen this and raise its capacity in two ways. Like, yes, you can increase your calf capacity by running more, running faster, doing all those sorts of things, but it needs to be really delicate. You adapt to calf strength in your running by running. Like, that's the most specific way you can do it. You can do hill repeats, or you could do strides, or you could do, faster sprint sessions. You can definitely do that, but what you're doing to try and solve that solution is just by more running. And these injuries happen due to overuse, doing the same thing over and over and over again. So it can be done, but there's risks associated with that. And so the other way you can do it is meet those conditions, but in the gym. And that's a lot safer. It's slow, heavy load. If you do 3 sets of 10, that's a lot safer than trying to raise the capacity by doing a sprint session. It's you can get you can get to the same point by both of those approaches, but one is a lot more riskier than the other in my eyes.
Yeah. So just kind of circling back there is, are you saying that you do kind of promote more repetitions before adding external load and lifting heavier first?
Are you talking about in the gym?
Yeah. Yeah. So
So
if we're
in the
looking
gym,
to increase, like, okay, so I guess we're probably segueing into like the capacity of our tissues, right? And how do we raise that capacity for the loads that we're doing? And we kind of talked about proper load management and how we progress that in our running. So now I guess we're kind of probably talking and shifting conversation a little bit of like building up the capacity in our tissues. So do you mind just reiterating your point there?
yeah. So you raise the capacity in a number of ways. One, you raise the capacity in your running. So you increase your mileage gradually, you increase your hills or your speed work, whatever your goals are. That's how you raise the capacity, which hopefully, if you've listened to the first part of this conversation, it's do so gradually, do so sensibly, and avoid abrupt changes in training. The other way you can do it is in, some form of cross training. That's sort of, if you can find a cross training alternative, usually for cardiovascular purposes, but you really raise the capacity efficiently with strength training. And if you haven't done squats, lunges, deadlifts, calf raises before, if you're very inexperienced, then yes, you would start with body weight. You'd start with, high reps, but the goal is to eventually start adding the weight and hover around a rep range of 8 to 10. So by the 8th or 10th rep, it's really challenging. And that's eventually what we want to progress to. We don't want to pile on the weight straight away, because if you haven't done a squat before, you're going to run into trouble with back pain or knee pain and those sorts of things. So we do want to be safe in the gym. But I've seen people do single leg squats and they hold on to a 5 kilo dumbbell and that's their exercise, and they do that for 6 months straight. No systematic progression to increase the weights. I actually don't prioritize a lot of the single leg stuff. Yes, running's a single leg exercise and we want to meet those conditions, but we do that in your running. And what we want to do, the purpose of getting into the gym is to do something to raise the capacity to meet conditions that, the body just won't meet during your running. You want variety, but you want to raise the capacity in a way that, you won't meet in the running. That way we will get an overuse injury if we keep doing that. And so I've found that because you want to do the slow, heavy stuff, like you said, like the muscles, they work 2 to 3 times your body weight, 5 to 6 times your body weight with the amount of force that's required. So we do need to go heavy. If you've had a tendon issue in the past, we know that tendons love slow, heavy load. The tendon synthesis, like their adaptation process, is a lot more efficient if you do it slow and heavy once you've adapted to it. But you can't go slow and heavy with single leg exercises. I've had people try to do hamstring rehab because the proximal hamstring of the proximal part of the hamstring, that tendon is undergoing overload. And we try and do slow, heavy load, but they're doing single leg deadlifts and they simply can't foster the right balance, the right control, the right speed, and the right weight unless they do double leg. And so
Right.
I've seen people just, that's all they needed. I've had an injury chat with someone and I just did a podcast episode where we talk about their success story. All they did was make a shift from single leg exercises to double leg exercises, and their tendon rehab just took a huge turn for the better. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for slow, heavy load. And if we're talking about the calf, my favorite exercise is a double leg standing bent knee calf raise. So I'm coming up onto my toes and back down while maintaining a slight knee bend, and that biases the soleus, the muscle underneath the gastroc. And I load up 35 kilos heavier than my body weight. So I'm at about 90, 95 kilos, 3 sets of 10. I'm really pushing hard to get to that 10 reps and do that twice a week. And I feel like that's good conditions to carry over into raising the capacity of that particular unit.
Yeah, so much gold there. I will challenge you on a couple of points not related to tendon loading specifically, because I am pretty passionate about making sure that runners have single leg stability. So I guess the only thing I want to add to that is not from a loading perspective, but more from a stability perspective in working your foot intrinsic muscles, your ankle stabilizers, and your side hip muscles from a stability standpoint for running. I like single leg exercises and have that in my plan for, I really think all runners should be doing it, but not with the goal, as you mentioned, for tendon loading or strengthening or building up the capacity of tissues. And I completely agree with you, like with the proximal hamstring tendinopathy, which is like pretty wild, because if someone's listening to this, I don't know, I think you and I both probably have combined to produce like the most comprehensive resources for proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So we see a lot of runners with this condition. And yeah, I rarely even give the single leg RDL exercises out anymore. And if I'm going for that loading, it is with 2 legs. But I do have to say, like the Nordics and even like eccentric heel slides, like with the bridge on 1 leg, I do like a lot, because they are very challenging, and I feel like is stressing that hamstring muscle and tendon enough. But and I would agree, because we just had a client who finished up and he was like, yeah, when I really started adding the weight with the RDLs with 2 legs, he felt like much better improvements in his symptoms from that tendon loading capacity standpoint. And with the calf muscles, I completely agree, Brodie. We have to add that weight gradually. And, we can't just like, I guess probably Brodie and I'm speaking for you now, Brodie, is we don't want you to go away from this episode thinking like, holy cow, like I've been underloading. I'm not doing enough strengthening with heavy weights. And don't just go from like 0 to 100, right? And build that weight up. And I'll use myself as an example, Brodie. It wasn't until last year, it was actually at this time right now, I did a couple episodes on this. It was January, February, where I started for the first time since college, which for me, I'm a lot older than you are. It was like probably 20 years since I actually did some, I'm going to call it air quotes here for the podcast listeners, heavy squats and heavy deadlifts, because every time I attempted to do it, I always hurt my back. And I just figured like, hey, I got some long legs. I got long femur bones. I'm just not meant to squat. I'm not meant to deadlift. It's just not for me. I don't need to do that to stay like healthy. And last year I went back to, getting down my movement patterns, and my goal was to add load and strength train heavy with lower reps to build up the tissue capacity. But it's not where I started. Like I talked about in the podcast, Brodie, I was like, went in the gym and I'm like there with just the bar, and I'm like squatting, and like, these, meatheads around me are looking at like, why is this dude just squatting the bar? Like, but I knew I needed to, like, the quality was important to me, and I needed to get the movement patterns down. And I gradually increased my weight to where, like, now it's, I only can get 5 to 8 reps with the amount of weight that I'm squatting or the amount of weight that I'm deadlifting, because it is heavy enough that I can't do any more than that.
Good
Right.
on ya.
So yeah, just take that time, guys, if you are going to implement any of the things that we're talking about, because as Brodie mentioned before, then it's like you're exceeding the load, just like in your running. If you go and try to squat, 300 pounds like tomorrow, and you haven't been squatting any of that. And trust
Yeah.
me, like your muscles are going to feel just even a little bit of stimulus, and they're going to get sore, and you're going to feel like, hey, this is actually doing something.
Yeah. And there's another good study looking at the patella ligament, the patella tendon at the front of your knee, and looking at the tendon synthesis. So, how it adapts to mechanical load. And they used two examples. They had one group that did a knee extension machine and pretty heavy. I think they did like 80% of their 1 RM, and they did 3 sets of 8 to 10. And they sort of calculated how much load goes through that tendon, how much tendon synthesis it undertakes, and the amount of running that you need to do in order to stimulate that same amount of load is running for about 16 kilometers. And so what's safer in terms of overload and in terms of raising the capacity, doing 3 sets of 10 knee extension or running for 16 kilometers? It's crazy, but the body, when it comes to running, actually becomes quite numb to that stimulus really quickly. So initially when you start running, think of the body just saying to itself, oh, this is new, this is exciting, I'm bouncing, I'm bounding, I'm like adapting to it. But then after a couple of minutes, it's sort of like, okay, I'm looking for variety. I'm kind of getting bored of this. I kind of used to this, and it numbs to the adaptation process. Yes, your cardiovascular system continues with that challenge. It's like, oh yeah, keep going. Oh yeah, it's challenging, and the longer run, your cardiovascular system will continue to develop. But when it comes to stimulus of your bones and of your tendons, it gets quite numb to it unless you offer that variety. And so, what's I'd say when it comes to overuse injuries, a lot safer just to do 30 reps of an exercise that's slow, controlled, and yeah, it's when we talk, like you say, about the question about how do we raise capacity, just a stark reminder about how effective you can be in the gym once you start doing some of that slow, heavy stuff.
Yeah, and then I guess I would also say, for those that have been injured and they've gone to PT before or physio, and they've been giving exercise for that injury, and then they're discharged because their pain got better, right? That exercise that you were given was where you were at that point in time. And if you're looking to continue to grow as a runner, you should be progressing beyond that specific exercise or adding resistance, right? And continue to challenge the tissue in order to build up the capacity that Brodie's talking about. So, you know, I feel like sometimes people either go from like one extreme to the other. You get people who are like, oh, these were my like PT exercises, and now I'm done with that. I've graduated. And now I just go to either not doing any exercises because you're not injured anymore. Or you get people who are like, yeah, man, I've been doing these exercises religiously for like 10 or 20 years. And I'm like, literally the same exercise? Like you're just doing
Mm.
like the clamshell for like 20 years? Like, yeah, I've been doing. I'm like, well, what is your goal? Like, why are you doing it? Right. And like, we want to think, if your goal is to stay healthy as a runner and or get faster and or run further, like we need to progress beyond that. Right. And continue building up the capacity in that tissue so you can run faster or you can run longer. So I'm sure you see some of that as well.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's It's sort of like you need that next step of the roadmap. It's okay, this is what it looks like after, once you're back to pain-free running, these are the steps you should take. And most of the time it is continue to progress until you meet the demands of running or exceed it. A good scenario, as hypothetical as it is, but if you have the capacity of all your tissues, ligaments, bones, muscles, if you have the capacity a lot higher than you could possibly reach within your running, then you can't get an overuse injury. There's under recovery, which is an element of the load capacity model, which we haven't talked about yet. But in an ideal sense, that's kind of where you want to be. You want to continue stimulating that tissue or that injury and continue building up that capacity to far exceed what it could possibly generate within your running. And once your running builds up, people go from a 10K to a half marathon to a full marathon. Like, as those progressions naturally fall into place, you need to raise the capacity. And so your squats need to get heavier, your lunges need to get heavier, your calf raises, all that sort of stuff. It sort of just needs to meet the demands that you supply. The only time I would ever tell someone to, you know, not progress is if they don't want to progress in their running. If they say, okay, I'm doing my heavy squats twice a week, it's 40 kilograms, 3 sets of 10. I'm running 5Ks a week, 5Ks 3 times per week, and I don't want to improve. I don't want to get further. I don't want to get faster. I don't want to do anything like that. I'd say, you know what, let's just hit that maintenance phase. But rarely does that happen. Rarely does a runner want to do that. So progression's the key.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned it, so I got to ask now is, what role do you see like recovery playing in injury prevention, or, what do you consider under recovery?
Yeah. And again, it's still that load versus capacity model. So you've got one pillar, which is your load, your training loads, how far you're running, what you're doing in the gym, cross training, that physical demand. That capacity is how much your tissues can withstand. Your capacity can diminish if you under recover. And so that's where it gets really tricky. Someone can, like, theoretically, you can have an overuse injury, but your training remains consistent, no changes whatsoever. You can get an overuse injury if your recovery doesn't match. So sleep is the number one recovery tool you have. So I'll bring that up. If you get all of your foam rollers, dry needling, massage, every single, like those massage guns, if you pile all of those on top of one another, it won't get close to exceeding the benefits of a good night's sleep. So sleep, very, very important. You can train consistently and all of a sudden, like we talked about before, I've got a baby due in June. If you have a newborn baby and you lack sleep, all of a sudden 2 weeks, poor sleep, you can train consistently and get an overuse injury, because when you don't sleep and your recovery is affected, your tissues can't adapt the same way. They don't have the capacity. They can't restore. They can't regenerate. They don't have that ideal sense to recover. And so that's when injuries can pop up. So sleep is number one. I would say stress is number two. So like emotional stress, psychological stress. You could be stressed out at work, which, generally carries over into your sleep anyway. When those sort of things are negatively impacted, you need to make the conscious decision to not progress or even pull back your training loads until things start to turn into your favor. And I spoke to Eric Hegedus on the podcast. He's a researcher, and he was saying the 4 signs of an injury that's just around the corner is if, you've got muscle soreness, if you have like fatigue, like mentally fatigued, if you're not sleeping well, and if you're stressed. And so a lot of those things, if 4 of those domains are negatively impacted, an injury is just around the corner unless you change your training loads. Very, very important. So it's still that load versus capacity model. We spend most of our time focusing on that load, but there are lifestyle factors that influence the capacity.
Oh, I just love how you really tied that into our conversation today of loading capacity, because now you've mentioned a third pillar of kind of the 6-part plan of how we stay healthy and build like a durable body and grow as runners is that recovery bucket. So I love how you really kind of integrated that into load and capacity. And yeah, this is the biggest thing that we need to educate our clients on, honestly. It's, once they get a structured plan from us and they have the accountability, the guidance, like they're all in, right? Like we work with like motivated people, right, who are dedicated. They're like gonna do this, right? They've invested. But the recovery piece is the hardest part for us to, get them to embrace. And like we say, it is actually part of the training. Like the recovery is part of your training. It's not only the runs that we have on your calendar, it's not only the strength sessions and the exercises we're giving you, but it's the recovery. And like you said, sleep is definitely that big one, and life stressors. So I love how you really tied that into today's topic. And, as we kind of, wrap up, is there anything else that we didn't cover about like the science of kind of load versus tissue capacity and how we really prevent injuries that you want to share?
I suppose from a I guess we didn't really dive into listening to your body a little bit because you could, finding your adaptation sweet spot. It's about, not underloading, but not overloading, finding somewhere in the middle. Listening to how your body's responding to workouts is really important to finding that sweet spot. It's the same when you're injured, same when you're not injured. It's all about finding those things. But one thing that I guess I didn't cover is you kind of want to overload yourself a little bit. Like it's not about your sweet spot isn't just this maintenance phase. You do want to, I guess, dip your toes into the overload and then go back into the sweet spot. If we had this sort of graph, which I have in my book, it's just like flirting in and out of that overload, optimal recovery sort of cycle, which allows you to adapt more efficiently and get better, quicker, faster. So you might have a little bit of muscle soreness afterwards. You might have a little bit of joint stiffness, or you might, be challenged a little bit. Your body might be showing signs of overload, but that needs to be backed up with recovery. So as soon as you have delayed onset muscle soreness or, a little bit of stiffness here and there, don't see that as your overtraining. See that as, okay, that's testing my limits. I don't want to do that too often. I don't want to go too far in that direction, but I also need to recover really well on the back end so that I adapt quicker. And you don't want that overload, soreness, stiffness to be throughout the vast majority of your week. You want that, once or twice here and there. But it's just about flirting with that boundary line. You can test your limits. It just needs to be structured really carefully.
I love it. Dipping the toe in the water. And yeah, to see change, we have to add that stimulus to our bodies. So I know there's going to be many runners who are like, wow, this is like making sense. Hopefully we had some light bulb moments for you guys. If you've been listening during your run or you're listening in the car, Brodie, tell let the listeners know, where they can get the book. Where's the best place for them to go and start following all the great content that you are putting out there?
So you can just search Run Smarter, Brodie Sharpe. That's like the title of the book. The title of the book's Run Smarter. And you can, get that on Amazon, get it where most online bookstores will be selling it. You can listen to the Run Smarter podcast if podcasts are your, main medium of absorbing information. And yeah, I've just started YouTube as well. If you want to run smarter with Brodie Sharpe, if you want to look that up, I'm trying to educate runners more of a visual element as well as just the audio and the book. So trying to reach everyone in all different ways of communication. But yeah, if you're interested, I think most people find the podcast their first kind of like step into learning how to run smarter. The first 10 episodes cover 10 universal principles to reduce your risk of injury or overcome injury. That's usually what I direct people as like the first step, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend you guys check it all out. The book's amazing. Congrats again, Brodie. I appreciate you coming on again. It's always a blast just kind of chatting with you, and I hope everyone did enjoy our conversation today. So Thanks again, Brodie. I appreciate your time.
Always have fun talking with you, Duane. Thanks again for the opportunity.
And thank you to the listener, whether you're listening now during your run, watching the video version on the Spark Healthy Runner YouTube channel. I appreciate all of you. As always, let's maintain a strong mind, a strong body, and just keep running.